Hey, Earthlings! When I used to start my lectures at the university, I used to start by saying to the students, hello, Earthlings. And the question then is, how did that come about and when, in a way? Because the most natural thing to think is that it's something to do with the Earthlings film in 2005. And I thought that it was something else. In fact, I thought it was this.
Come in, Captain Scarlet. You are expected. This is the voice of the Mr. Hans. We know that you can hear us, Earthmen.
So, yeah, I thought it was that, but as you can tell, they say Earthmen, don't they, not Earthlings. So, dodgy memory seems to have be the case. So, anyway, to business. I'm not long back from London Vegfest, and so I want to thank Tim and Alan and Karen, and they do a lot of organising and work for these events, and I always call it kind of, at London at least, I always call it kind of like a conference with a Vegfest underneath, so when I tend to look at it. I also want to give a special thanks to Jeremy Hess, who did a heck of a lot of filming and now doing a heck of a lot of editing of the film, and there's two out at the moment from Jeremy, my talk on the pioneers of the movement, and also kind of like an interview kind of discussion that we had together. And I think there's some more on the way, I'm not quite sure, but I think there's some panel recordings coming. So what am I up to now? Well, this really, because I did a series of blog entries for Vegfest Express on the lead up to London, so I thought, well, I'll do a video version of them, a short kind of video version, because nobody reads nowadays, and I'll put the link, of course, down below, just in case it inspires you to do so. Now, the first of, I think we did 8 in the end, and there's an intro from Tim Barford, so that's kind of 9 in a kind of series. The first was called The Difficult and Argumentative Birth of the Vegan Social Movement. So I was trying to make clear that I'm not talking about the first people who were on a plant-based diet, or a first culture that adopted a plant-based diet or anything like that. I'm talking about the people, the first lot of people who came together, as far as we know anyway, in an organized social movement, a cause. So that's what we're talking about, the vegan social movement. And the vegan social movement, as many of you will know, was born in 1944, and that was the time of war, a global conflict, no less. I always like to say that the vegans kind of declared peace during the time of war, and in fact that's what they subsequently kind of went to try and work out, you know, what had happened to humanity and what would we kind of do about it, you know, and veganism became a big part, a central part of their version of the solution, if you like, to why we'd become so violent. Now, the vegan social movement really started from attempts to make a non-dairy section of the Vegetarian Society, which was an ongoing kind of project for many years for a few people, and the vegetarians said no in the end. And I think that's a good thing, in the sense that yeah, I think, well, the thing is, they did it for their own reasons, but the vegetarians also said to the pioneers, and particularly Elsie Shrigley at the time, and also Donald Watson, the two of the co-founders of the movement, they said, well, look, instead of having a non-dairy section, why don't you kind of like break out on your own, you know, kind of do your own thing, man, you know, all that. And I think that was a really good thing to happen, because what they did in the subsequent decade was declare themselves to be the vegans, and also work out what veganism meant. And I think that their radical vision as it came to evolve probably wouldn't have done that if they were kind of like subsumed under the Vegetarian Society. So I think in that sense we could say that the vegetarians did the vegans quite a favour, so that's a pretty good thing. Now, the relationship between the vegetarians and the vegans, Watson actually called vegetarians weird, and he kind of famously, not many times, but he famously called them the lactose, you know. And he said that they were weird because they were kind of using humanity's capacity to exploit the reproductive system of other species. So veganism has always been critical of vegetarianism, and so that's the key to that. There's nothing wrong with that. The idea is be critical of vegetarianism, but don't necessarily attack vegetarians. So that's the kind of like the way it was. In fact, Watson said that there's no reason why the vegans couldn't have a kind of like a working relationship, or at least a kind of relationship with the vegetarians as an ongoing kind of thing. So how, in the run-up, if you like, to the formation of the vegan movement, what was going on? Well, between something like 1909 and 1912, and then after the First World War, there was a vigorous correspondence, as it was put, about non-flesh animal products. There was a lot of kind of toing and froing about that. So this shows that there was a lot of people who would now be called vegans in the vegetarian movement in those kind of early days. For example, in a 1910 cookbook, Rupert Wheldon said this: "It's quite impossible to consume dairy products without slaughter, as it is to eat flesh without slaughter." Now that's quite a statement to make in 1910, and it sounds quite modern, doesn't it? Another 1910 writer reminded the vegetarians that when cows become old and or diseased, then they become the property of the butcher, as they put it. So whether that was one of the first early critiques of the property status of other animals, I'm not quite sure, but it certainly is that, in the sense that they're exploited on the dairy farm, and then lo and behold, once they're spent, that delightful industry term for worn out other animals, then they're taken to the butcher, via the house of slaughter, of course. And so Watson essentially argues that it was the milk issue that brought the foundation of the vegan social movement. There is an interesting kind of like comment on that from John Davis, and he was a historian for the International Vegetarian Union, it was called. And he says that when they spoke in those days about non-dairy, that actually meant non-dairy, non-eggs, and mostly non-honey. So it was kind of like a catch-all phrase. So even though if you look at the early writing, there's a lot of talk about non-dairy, but apparently that kind of meant a little bit wider than that in the first place. By 1944, people like Donald Watson were saying things like the cow feels the loss of her calf in much the same way as a human mother would the loss of her child, and adding that they would sometimes cry for days. That quote from 44 reminds me of something that happened to me when I was took part in one of my first Dublin Earthlings protests or events, whatever you want to call it. And I got talking to some dairy farmers who were there looking at the screens. And one of them said that one of the most upsetting things for them as a dairy farmer was the lowing of the mothers. Lowing meaning the crying out and calling, as Watson said. And also the calves of course, call back to their mothers if they can hear them as well. So I asked this dairy farmer a question, and I was quite surprised by the answer, because I said, if you separate the calf from the mother straight away, is that better or worse, in bunny rabbit ears, than separating them as it was in this case? She separated the mothers from the calves at 5 months, and she claimed that it was the latter case which was worse, in the sense that once they were kind of with each other for 5 months, they'd fully bonded with each other, as you might expect, of course, and they got into the routine of being together and everything. And so separation at that point was actually worse than if you separate them at birth, which obviously is one of the things that we kind of claim, isn't terrible that they separate them at birth. Really it's terrible that they separate them at all, and in some ways, if it's going to be done, which obviously it shouldn't, that's a rights violation, but if it's going to be done, it's kind of weird that it's probably better to do it early rather than late. So there you go. Anyway, so 1944 is the birth of our movement, the vegan social movement. It was born then, and poor old Donald Watson was kind of left for quite a while to do all the work. And, you know, he was the secretary and did the finances. He put out all the calls about what we're going to call ourselves. And obviously vegan came in the end to the idea that we would call the vegan movement veganism. And so that will be the part 2 of this little series of these brief kind of intros to these blog entries on Donald Watson. So that will be part 2. This has been part 1. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye, Earthlings.